What's up, YouTube? So somebody mentioned about or asking questions about Sultai, and I mentioned that I've kind of been like messing around with Sultai recently again. As I'm sure I've said before, it's my favorite color combination, and when you can mix it with Death Shadow, it's a really cool feeling. Obviously, like losing out on red is a non-zero factor. Not getting access to Ragavan, Dragon's Rage Channeler, Unholy Heat, Underworld Breach, Croxa, Teamer Battle Rage, like all expressive iteration, all really big considerations. So my biggest issue with Sultai has always been it doesn't really have like an identifier. It doesn't have a reason to go Sultai. For example, you go Jund because you want the aggressive creatures. You want Shadow, Goyf, Ragavan, Scourge of the Skyclave sometimes, Darcy. You go Grixis because you want to play the mid range route. You want access to expressive iteration at Gigantha, Kroxa, Underworld Breach, any of that kind of stuff. You go Demir because you want to have the control elements. You want to be able to play your counter spells and your Archmage's charms and Brazen Borrowers, Murktides, all that. But then you go Sultai, and it's kind of, why am I here? Like, what am I doing? I get access to like the blue red or blue black pieces that aren't controlling. I don't get the counter spells and the Murktides. I get access to the Grixis pieces that aren't mid range. I don't get the Kroxa and the Underworld Breach and the expressive iteration. I get the Jun pieces without the ability to close out games quickly. I don't get the bolts and battle rages and Scourge of the Sky claves and stuff like that. So Sultai is kind of the leftovers of everything else, and your hope is that you get to play like enough big creatures to warrant going green, and enough interaction on the stack to warrant going blue, and enough of the hand disruption and life loss to warrant playing Death Shadow. And that's kind of like Sultai's identifying feature. For a little bit there, it had Uro. And I know people said, like, oh, Uro in your shadow deck, it's bad. But when you have like one Uro that you can traverse up at a moment's notice, it's a really cool piece to have available. But as soon as you start like dropping those really big heavy hitters, then your reasoning for going into the color combinations a little sketchy. So really what we're trying to see with Sultai is if like you have all of these bits and pieces and we throw them together, is the sum going to be less than or equal to the individual pieces? Like, is the total going to be less than or equal to the sum of its parts? And yeah, that's about all we can say. So we've got things like the Force Stubborn Denial, the Force Shadow, um, Foreshadow, Forethought Seas, a lot of your typical Shadow base. You got four Orcish Bowmaster, the new piece from the Lord of the Rings set that everybody's up in arms about. Four Goy, four Drown in the Lock, four Street Wraith, and we're throwing in some value pieces. A Dress Down, got to Traverse the Open Wall, a Terrace Under in the main, and EE in the main. Shadow of Mortality that we can traverse for, so kind of like two copies. Um, but it's kind of like our Murktide replacement. We've got a sideboard with some Spreading Seas, Spell Pierces, four copies of Dothy Voidwalker, which might seem like a bit much, but I'm really hoping that it'll shine against things like Living End, Rhinos, the Asmo food decks, the Samwise combo decks. They're showing up everywhere. Two Turok, another copy of Terra Sunder, Collector Oof, a Grist, an EE, and an Unlicensed Hearse. A lot of like sideboard options that I've ported over from Demir, as well as like the Terra Sunder, because we want a good way to answer artifacts and enchantments. And Terra Sunder exiling instead of destroying means it gets to deal with the ring. Collector Oof was kind of a traversable target to hate on the Asmo decks, as well as a way to fight against random things like Tron and seen Prison Tron in leagues recently. Seen a lot of Lantern Control recently. Stuff like that. Gris, a reasonable mid-range value target. So let's just kind of go in. Like, I play, at least at the moment, a lot of cards that I think are kind of fun and interesting. I haven't put like hundreds of hours into testing Sultai like I have with Dimir. So I'm definitely not going out and saying that the card choices are optimal, but mostly just like stuff I want to play at the moment. So on the draw, decided to throw back the first 7 of 4 lands, Wraith, Bowmaster, Drown, just because like the hand doesn't really do anything until like turn 3 on the draw. That's just way too slow. Second hand was like 5 lands as Wraith or 5 lands of Bauble and a Stub. So really bad there. Keep a 5 with the Bauble, Wraith, Goyf. So a lot of ways to find the second land, which we do before we even have to Bauble trick ourselves. So at the very least, we do have like a turn 2, 3/4 Goyf. The ability to cycle Wraith, get it up to a 4/5. Fatal Push might get it to a 5/6. If we get to Fatal Push something, we could have Delirium. I thought based off the Island Lorien reveal that it was blue-black mid-range or blue-black control, but instead it's just Rhinos. Far less exciting. But at the very least, like, we do have a Fatal Push target. We have a Wraith target. I say Wraith target, we just Wraith ourselves. Could traverse for a Shadow, but I think I'd rather hold up Drown to try to fight over another copy of Crashing Footfalls. And if our opponent's just going to like attack end, and now we have either Shadow of Mortality online, we hit the land so we can traverse for a Shadow, play a Shadow, and a Shadow of Mortality. I should have played the Shadow of Mortality before I attacked for this exact reason. If my opponent had a way to deal with the Shadow of Mortality, then maybe I don't want to attack with the Goyf. That being said, I don't think I'm winning if I don't attack with the Goyf. But here we cast the Shadow of Mortality first in case our opponent has like another Mystical Dispute and just bad mana leaks it. But since they don't, we get to untap with a bunch of dudes and clear the game. So really nice win on a mold of 5 there. Sideboarding against Rhinos. These Bowmasters look really bad, bringing in like all 4 copies of Dothy, bringing in the EE. Like, we got an EE in the main, and having another copy in the side is really nice. Bubble ourselves. We see the land, so we keep that on top so we can draw into it. Kind of expecting an ice here, so I'm not cracking the fetch. I could play their crack the fetches and get a threat like a Tarmogoyf down, but instead I'm just going to hold up Drown in the Lock to be able to fight over Rhinos on their turn. And if they go for it on my turn, I can Drown, and if they force, I can at least Fatal Push a Rhino. So like my burden to deal with stuff. Is that the best way of saying that? My burden of stuff to deal with is much lower. But now that I've hit like all these lands, I can at least get a Shadow down. I could play Goyf and hold up Drown, but I kind of want to like play Shadow, hold up Drown. If they force that, then have a Fatal Push for a Rhino, Street Wraith, and a fetch to outgrow Rhino. Also could have fought over that Footfalls. I think I paused on it for a minute and kind of decided like, okay, well, they have to make the first move to deal with my Shadow, or my Shadow just stands in front and like eats Rhinos all day. So I kind of let them have that. And when they went for Odawara, I felt amazing for my decision because I got to just kill off Rhinos and they didn't progress the board any. I get to have a really, really strong rebuild here. Blood Moon, a little more unfortunate, but hey, what are you going to do? Uh, really surprised they didn't have a second copy of an island there to get so that they could hard cast a Lorien Revealed if they drew another, but we're just going to top deck like gods and like EE away these Rhinos. But maybe they were getting a second non-basic for Fury, and then as soon as I like wraithed a bunch, that the Fury didn't matter. Which I was wraithing in response to the Blood Moon to try to find Stubborn Denial to hit the moon. But it's not the biggest deal in the world. So this is round number 2. Thoughtseize into an Oliphant means Living End. Oh boy. Generous Int and a Curator. So I know they've got Shardless Agent this turn. If they choose to go for it, I can Stubborn Denial. If they didn't go for it, I could Bowmaster. Thankfully, they're going to just put it on the stack. Let me stub. Cannot turn on Delirium yet. So, not that I really have anything worth traversing for. Here, Bowmaster before they draw, just in case. Like, I know I get to kill down the Shardless Agent, but we're just hoping they don't find another copy of Living End, and yeah, you know, that's how it goes. Usually with any of the blue-black based shadow builds, you very rarely lose to the first copy of Living End, but second, third, fourth can be problematic. Either way, pretty good 7. Pierce, Thoughtseize, couple Street Wraiths. We just really need to stop drawing lands and start drawing threats, which of course means we're going to draw more lands. You'd think we're in a rough spot right here, right? Like all these lands, no threat. Cycle the dress down into a land. Okay. Dolthy. Dolthy is really good. Dolthy's apparently good enough to make our opponent scoop on the spot. I would talk about the Dolthy interaction with Living End, but I believe it ends up coming up this game. So instead of talking about it there, we get to actually show it here. So let's pause. Dolthy in the graveyard. Let's say Dolthy is on the battlefield and your opponent casts the card Living End. What happens? They go through the process of resolving the Living End. The entire graveyard, all the creatures in the graveyard get put into exile. All the creatures in the battlefield get sacrificed. So Dolthy goes to the graveyard. All the creatures from exile come onto the battlefield. And Living End goes to the graveyard. And Dolthy has done nothing. So you do not want Dolthy on the battlefield when Living End resolves. Important distinction there. When Living End resolves, you don't want Dolthy on the battlefield. You want Dolthy on the battlefield before it resolves so that you can exile all the cyclers as they're coming down, keep the graveyard from getting built up. What you want when Living End resolves is Dolthy in the graveyard, because what happens is all the stuff in the graveyard gets exiled, all the stuff on the board gets sacrificed, put in the graveyard. Everything from exile comes onto the battlefield, and then Living End resolves, which means it gets exiled with Dolthy Voidwalker. So now you have a copy of Living End with the Void counter on it, and you can sacrifice your Dolthy and cast that card without paying its mana cost, which doesn't have a mana cost anyway, but because of the way kind of similar to Cascade. When you don't play its mana cost, it doesn't matter if it doesn't have a mana cost. It's not like Snapcaster. You just get to cast your opponent's living end and reset everything. So everything that is in the graveyard now comes back. Everything on the battlefield goes away. But because you sack the Dalthy to cast your opponent's living end, you get your Dalthy back off of the living end that you cast. So it creates a really good cycle. The downside being it doesn't work too well against Violent Outburst. Like, it really wants your opponent to play a sorcery speed Cascade spell so that you can go to your turn, get a Dalthy without summoning sickness, sack it, recast the living end, get the Dalthy back. But if you have questions about that interaction, feel free to leave them in the comments down below or ask on the Discord, anything like that, which will have a link to the Control Freak Discord down below. But you'll see, like right here, my opponent top decks a Cascade spell. And I'm fine with that because it's sorcery speed on their turn, which means I get this Dalthy out of my yard. The Dalthy exiles living end as it's resolving. So now I get to go to my turn after they grief me and blah, 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 blah. And I get to sack Dalthy, target their living end, recast it, sack their board. I get the Dalthy back. I get my shadow back. And now they get like one turn to top deck another Cascade spell. If it's a sorcery speed one, then I get to do the whole thing again. If it's instant speed, like Violent Outburst, then we could have some issues. But we just end up getting a second Dalthy, so we can always have a Dalthy on the battlefield and one in the graveyard if they have another Cascade spell, which they do not. So Dalthy does work. Void Walker out here void winning. Round 3. Scam. If you didn't see, Scam took like 5 of the top 8 places in one of the recent challenges. So if you're brewing or you're trying out a variant of Shadow or anything else, and you feel like you're just auto losing to Scam, probably not a good time to play that Shadow variant. That being said, it does make it a little bit of a rough time for Dimir. I know that some people have talked about having a reasonable Scam matchup. Like, I think I've had a positive record against Scam, but a lot of that's been like variance and positive decision making. But I know that there have been other people that have really struggled against Scam and considered it like an auto loss. And if you're in that category, then maybe you don't want to play a ton of whatever Shadow variant you're messing around with right now. The red versions do a whole lot better, like having access to Unholy Heat to destroy any sort of a scammed creature is really big. Sultai. At the moment, I've got a basic swamp and a basic island. I've played the basic forest before for things like Terra Sunder and Natural State, but ultimately, like, I feel like if I get a threat down quickly, then I'm fine with Blood Moon after I get a threat down. But if my opponent gets a Blood Moon down and I don't have a threat, then like counter spells aren't going to save me. So it really depends on your variant of Shadow, I guess. And if you're playing Grixis and you're expecting a whole lot of Scam, please, please, please play the basic island. I would so much rather have the basic island against Scam than worry about the basic mountain against the aggro decks. Because, like, you can fetch around needing the basic island a whole lot easier than you can fetch around, or you can fetch around the needing the basic mountain against the aggro decks a whole lot easier than you can fetch around not having the basic island against the Blood Moon decks. All right, so drown on our turn so we can stop this Feign Death, which kind of figure they have. Like, they've been doing nothing for a little while. We do have Terra Sunder to fight over a Blood Moon. We could flash in Bowmaster, but I really don't want to just go that whole back and forth of Bowmaster you, Bowmaster your Bowmaster, blah, Bowmaster your Bowmaster, blah, 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 blah. Too much to think about. So instead, we're just going to draw go for a while. Get our Bowmaster bolted, which is kind of fine, because like at this point, I'm just hoping to hit another land drop, get down Shadow with Drown. Like, I know their last two cards are EE, Undying Malice. We can counter any sort of threat off the top. We can tear us under a Blood Moon. And if we hit another land, then now we have the ability to Shadow, hold up Stub for the EE, and then Drown in the Lock for like any sort of threat that comes off the top. You know, their draw for turns basic Mountain, so their last card in hand is an Undying Malice. We've got an attack for 5 this turn, hold up, Drown in the Lock. If you're looking for another like piece of interaction against scam and stuff early, Vendetta isn't too bad. It's like destroy a non-black creature, lose power or lose life equal to its toughness. So it hits Fury, hits Ragavan, but misses Grief. Dismembers, obviously really solid. The Edict effects, Shieldred's Edict, pretty good. Or if you want to get around the Undying effects, then there's always Sudden Edict. But Sudden Edict plays really, really bad into Seasoned Pyromancer. So a lot of it just involves like, let me pause so I can go over the decision making here. A lot of it involves adjusting your play pattern to account for the answers that you have available. So here my opponent's got a Scam Fury. I could play out a Shadow here and block Street Wraith, trade with the Fury, but then I've kind of got like nothing left. And if they do have a scam effect, I'm in really bad shape. I can't drown. I can cycle Street Wraith first and try to find an answer to the Fury. I end up deciding to try to just chump this turn, like get down Turok, chump the block here, and then untap next turn with like Wraith or Shadow, Wraith, Breeding Pool up so I can trade with the Fury and hold up Drown in the Lock for like a follow-up or an Undying effect or something like that. It's really risky. Like, every possible line I have is risky. My opponent could just have Removal Spell into Bolt, and there's nothing I can do about that. But alas, they do not have Removal Spell into Bolt, so I do get to get down the Shadow and have the Dismember here. Grief, kind of unfortunate. And then here, I just have to take the race option. Like, I'm dead to Bolt. I cannot beat Bolt. So I could sit here and let my opponent attack, and I can't block it. So I have to go for the attack. And if I'm going for the attack, I might as well cycle the Wraith, make it a guaranteed 2-turn clock. And then, like I said, I can't beat the Bolt. So, yeah, rough times. Say rough times. Like, we did top deck the Dismember to deal with the Fury. All right, so this is round number 4, I believe. Reasonable opening hand. Black Cleave Cliffs, Thoughtseize makes me believe back-to-back scam. We'll dismember the Dolthy here so that I could get down a shadow next turn if need be. Since we don't have Ferocious, I'm just going to leave the shadow back, sit on Drown, so if my opponent like fetches up a basic and goes for Blood Moon, I've got that covered. 2/2 shadow just dies to too much, so I don't think there's really a big incentive to play it out. And then here, playing out the Shadow Immortality, so if they have another Blood Moon, I can play basic Swamp and a Shadow. If they don't have a Blood Moon, then I can still play basic Swamp or play out Shadow next turn. Was not really expecting Scammed Fury there, for being honest. This was a Moto decision. I'll be completely honest. I played out the Shadow. My opponent had auto passed through it. So I played out the second Shadow and just went for the Drown on the Fury. So they were just completely F6'd. So we've got 2-turn clock with a Shadow and a Bowmaster ping. Traverse is a really good top deck. So now I can like go find another Shadow. I could go find a Tarmogoyf. Since I'm not expecting anything like engineered explosives in the main deck, then I think just getting another Shadow's fine. Also means I can ping myself and have 2 lethal Shadows next turn. Sideboarding against Scam. I don't know if I talked about it in the last matchup. I usually board out like a bunch of Wraiths and a few Thoughtseizes. Maybe a Stubborn Denial. Maybe a Drown. Board ends are like Turoks. Dress Downs. I think I boarded in the extra EE. And Grist. Grist has been really good against Scam. The extra Terra Sunder if you're afraid of Blood Moon. Fable of the Mirror Breaker, that kind of stuff. But we'll probably have to adapt a little bit with a lot of these shadow builds for Scam being everywhere. What that's going to look like, I'm not entirely sure yet. But maybe we want like some extra copies of something like Blood Chief's Thirst or something reasonable. Dress Down, such a good draw here. Let's talk about state-based actions real quick. So I Dress Down, which means obviously Dolthy loses Shadow, so I can block it. I could block it with my own Shadow, but the way state-based actions work is I go to my end step. That Shadow's got 3 damage marked on it by the Dolthy. Dress Down sacks itself, and there's still a exchange of priority and state-based actions checks before the end of the turn, which means the Dress Down disappears. Shadow goes back to a 3/3 damage marked on it and dies. So be careful in situations like this that you're not like Dress Downing in response to a bolt or something, because it only saves the Shadow until you're in step. So if you don't have a way to lose life, like a Wraith in hand or something like that, a fetch land up, then the Shadow's just going to die at the end of turn. Which is why I'm trading off the Dolthy and the token, or trading off the Bowmaster and the token and not blocking with the Shadow. If Shadow is like a 5/5, I'm probably blocking with it, but... And this attack just 100% screams Fury. Like, Bolt, maybe, but I don't think you're trading Ragavan and a Bolt for a Shadow. but I think you would trade a Ragavan for a Shadow and have a Fury on board. So I'm just going to tear asunder the Ragavan, because I can't stop a follow-up creature anyway. And sure enough, there's the Fury in the yard. So playing against cards like Fury a lot of the times is very similar to playing against cards like Solitude, where you're just trying to play around the blowout. Like my opponent having a 5/5 double striker on board for 5 mana against my like double stub EE hand is a blowout. But my opponent having a like 5/5 or 3/3 double striker for 5 against my shadow, my 7/7 or 9/9 shadow, whatever the case may be, is much better for me. So we've got Stubborn Denials for days. Go ahead and fetch, or go ahead and bobble ourselves here, because if my opponent does have like a Thoughtseize on their turn, I've got Stub. If they have Grief, I have a backup Stub. If they have like Bolt or something, I've got Stub. And we'll just take this attack. They would have to have like something pretty good to kill me here. And since that is not a lightning bolt, I get down Bowmaster, kill off every token, because they can only make 1 token off this Spyro. So I know with double Bowmaster triggers, I'm going to be able to kill their army plus the Spyro token, which just clears the way out for a lethal attack. If they did have like land Ragavan or something, then I would just have to like adjust my attacks to not be dead to that. But either way, on to round number 3. Or round number 5. God, I can't keep up with these rounds. I guess I could have looked and seen that my opponent's name was Burn Man and taken a guess at what they were playing, but Skullcrack off the top kind of confirms it. Bump in the Night I was not expecting, so that's kind of cool. Play out the Shadow, because if they want to like Skullcrack us, Searing Blaze the Shadow, whatever, we're pretty happy with that. Bowmaster, ping, and go to attack. I was really hoping to bait a burn spell on the Shadow so I could cycle the Street Wraith, keep the Shadow alive, get in a bigger attack. But instead, our opponents just got like a whole mess of spells at our face, and we die. But pretty expected for game 1, especially with a hand of like Dismember, Street Wraith, Bowmaster, Painland. So nothing really really crazy that game. I think we played it about as conservative as we could. The Sanctifier on Vec, pretty reasonable. Just go ahead and flash in a Bowmaster. If our opponent wants to like spend a burn spell or 2 on us here, that's okay. Say okay very loosely. Like, I don't want my opponent spending burn spells on us, but they're going to at some point, so there's a very good chance this Drown in the Lock's going to be fairly dead until they fetch. I would feel a little bit better. All right, so we've got this EE on 2. The downside is it does take out Sanctifier as well as Bowmaster and Goyf. So if I'm going to cast it, or if I'm going to cash in on it, I want to make sure it's like at a point where I can close out the game from there, because losing a Bowmaster and a Tarmogoyf and just being stuck with like a 1/1 army token probably isn't getting me across the finish line. But taking a few little chips and cashing in on this EE being a deterrent can get me across the finish line. Obviously, my opponent flooded out horrifically there, but I did think that was a pretty funny like bait EE. Like, oh, you need to attack because at any point I can just pop this and you lose the Sanctifier. But instead it just turned into like a sit there EE because we found a couple removal spells and they found creatures and lands. Thoughtseize first on turn 1 because I had the removal spell for the Swift Spear, but more importantly, I wanted to stop a potential Sanctifier. And if my opponent did have like quad burn spell and went to turn 2 with burn, attack him with Swift Spear, then I could just follow it up with play Shadow, hold up Fatal Push, and like be in a reasonable spot. But because I took Lightning Bolt, yeah, because I took Lightning Bolt and left them with Skewer, I knew that they'd either have to like use the Skewer right away or just sit on it. The fact that they used it right away meant I knew everything or knew most of what they could do. Got a bunch of spells out of hand, or all their spells out of hand that I knew about. This Bowmaster was really rough. So I was planning around like everything that I could counter. Like any of the 2-mana burn spells I'm great into here. I killed the Swift Spear, hold up stub, untap, attack, have stub, or drown. Did not have Bowmaster anywhere on my radar here. So I don't want to say this was like a punt because I don't think Bowmaster is something that I should be really considering here. But my opponent's shown me Bump in the Night, which I've seen Bump in the Night out of burn plenty of times. But having Bump in the Night and Sanctifier is a very, very aggressive mana base because you're not playing Godless Shrine in a burn deck. So maybe I could have insinuated that there has to be more of a reason to go black than just Bump in the Night. But I still don't think I would have played around Bowmaster. Fetch on my turn to play around Skewer the Critics. Attack in, force the block. My opponent's on a 1-turn clock to Shadow anyway, so I don't feel the need to play a second Shadow out. I'm just going to hold up, drown, and stub and hope it's enough. And turns out it is. So, nice. Pretty clean 4-1. Only loss there was to Scam, getting Blood Mooned out there at the end. Let's talk about some of the cards, how they performed. Shadow Mortality I thought was pretty good. We saw it really shine against Rhinos. We did see it get dealt with against Scam, but they had to have a Scammed Fury on like turn 5 or something, whatever it was. So I still think it's a very solid inclusion. Goyf was good. Bowmaster was pretty good into Spyro. Wraith, Dismember were fine. Terra Sunder in the main might be a little ambitious, so that could be anything from like the 19th land if you want the basic forest. It could be a second traverse, 4th fatal push, anything like that I think is reasonable. I do like the EE in the main. The dress down in the main, maybe that could come out since you're running the EE. But at the end of the day, like with Sultai, you need to be able to clear creatures out of the way so you can attack through, which I know is a big part of like why the battle plan was successful for a minute. The ability to make a guy with the Thorn Elemental text, make all your stuff deal damage though they weren't blocked. But I really think that package is very, very clunky. Like you have this whole slew of cards that are 1 mana, 2 mana, and then all of a sudden you add in a 4 mana, like 4 of. It's a very non-zero sum to play it. So I would be careful of that if that's a package that you really want to play going forward. In the sideboard, I thought the Dolthies were good. Turok might be a little ambitious in this build just because we're not running like 19, 20 lands. But we do have 4 Wraith, 4 Bobble, Traverse to find land. Spreading Seas, Pierce was good. Didn't see a Collector Roof matchup, but the other league that I ran with this, I did run into Tron, and Collector Roof shut down Tron pretty hard, which was fun. Grist has been reasonable out of the sideboard. I've been on 2. I'm still not sure what the correct number is there. But I do think Dolthy is one that's like really good on the play versus scam, really bad on the draw. So keep that in mind if you're boarding it in. Other than that, I'm going to be looking for additional cards to potentially bring in against Scam to kind of even that matchup. It really needs to be 1 mana interaction for a scammed threat. So maybe not. We can't really do more dismembers. We could, but really don't want more dismembers. But something that could handle a scam threat, and it could just be edict effects, like I said, because at least they do answer a threat after it's come down. But Sultai really needs like something to incentivize going into these color combinations, and I just haven't found that something yet. But as always, we'll keep working at it. Hope you enjoy the league. If you're enjoying the commentary, the content, drop a like, drop a subscription. Lets us know that you're enjoying what's going on. Otherwise, have a link to the Twitter, Control Freak Discord, Control Freak Twitch down below. So if you want to catch a live stream or see when they're going live, come talk about other content like this, then feel free to click on those links. Come say hey, always around. Otherwise, hope you all have an awesome rest of your day. Stay safe, enjoy some good food and company. I will catch y'all back live later. Adios for now.